I'm really pleased to have you all join us today. What we'd like to do today is to present some work that the Centre has been doing on the gender dimensions of climate change, and we have a really exciting kind of group of speakers who will firstly present the paper that the Centre has done in collaboration with. We're really pleased to have two respondents. So the paper, which is joint work from members of the climate change team in the Southern Centre for Inequalities Studies, will be presented by Sarah Cook and by Julia Taylor. So Sarah is a professor of economics at the University of Nottingham, Ningbo in China, and a visiting researcher at the Southern Centre for Inequalities Studies. Sarah's really kind of really known globally as a prominent feminist economist. She's worked previously as the director of the United Nations Research Institute for Social Development, at kind of UNICEF's kind of Innocenti Research Center. She was director of the University of South of kind of UNSW's Institute for Global Development in Australia. Had previously worked at the Institute for Development Studies in Brighton, and had been the Ford Foundation's program kind of program officer in Beijing in China. We've been really pleased at the Centre to have Sarah kind of join us in the Centre. The kind of co-presenter of the papers, Julia Taylor, who is a researcher on climate change and inequality at the Southern Centre for Inequalities Studies efforts. Julia had worked kind of previously at the Institute for Economic Justice, where she was a kind of researcher on climate kind of climate change, and was kind of the lead in their work on climate change. Julia has a BCom, a kind of MSc in Environment and Development from the University of Edinburgh, and a master's in Applied Development Economics efforts. She's currently enrolled for a PhD kind of program that is run jointly kind of in economics by kind of SOAS and WITS. We'll then have two respondents to the paper who will share with us some of their thoughts on kind of on these issues and on the topics that are covered in the paper. So first off, we'll have Maria Floro, who's kind of also known to many of us as Sergi, Sergi's an emeritus professor of kind of economics at the American University in Washington, D.C., and non-resident senior fellow at the Brookings Institution. Sergi's worked extensively in the field of feminist economics, and has done some path-breaking work in that field, kind of including work on kind of time use, on issues of care, on kind of issues of informal employment, and has led a number of global initiatives on issues of care. She's working at the moment on a book, the title of which is a research agenda on gender and development during climate change. We'll then have Olaisi, who is the executive manager responsible for policy and research at the Presidential Climate Commission. Lebogang has worked extensively in the field of climate change, was previously on the commission as one of their commissioners. She has worked as the head of the policy research unit at COSATU, and has been involved in a number of initiatives in South Africa, including at our National Economic Development and Labour Council on issues of climate change. Just a few introductory points from me before I pass on to Sarah. I think we would all accept that the two most overused words since the climate change issue has become a lot more urgent are the terms just transition. One key problem in that is that while there's lots of talk on a just transition, what is not at all clear is what are the gender dimensions of that of that justice. And our concern in starting to do some work in this field is that we think that there's a great risk that transition policies to address climate change will not only replicate structural gender inequalities that exist at present, but that it might well exacerbate these. So it's really with this in mind that we started this work, and we're really pleased to share some of our thoughts in this paper with you. So with that, let me pass it on to Sarah.
Thank you. Thank you, Imran, for that introduction and setting the scene. Can you all hear me okay?
We can hear you fine, Sarah.
Good. And maybe I think, Julia, you can move the slides on, and I'll just give a little bit more. I think Imran's already sort of set out what the background to this project and this paper is. Let me just say that the goal of the paper and the way we've written it, as we said at the bottom, is to propose a set of principles. And I think that's a big challenge. We'll talk through how we've approached this. It started, actually, I held with a colleague, Shimali Cerise, the co-author, a workshop just at the beginning of COVID with a lot of different feminist scholars to really try and understand from different disciplinary perspectives what these notions, both of justice from a gender perspective, and then what we could do to integrate those into debates on just transitions. And so this paper comes out of those initial discussions. If we move on to the next slide, I think the starting point then, as we say, the gender dimension, we feel that we can see is relatively neglected in the conversations about the just transition. And I'll talk in a little while about, the origin of that term. But what we see, obviously, and where we tried to start then in the paper was by thinking about, well, what are the gender injustices? And we see these as coming from two elements. One is actually the impacts of climate change itself. And I think we hear about those in academic writing, in news reports, in the press, the ways in which climate change impacts individuals, families, households, and where women, because of gendered inequalities, structural inequalities, may be more likely to experience more serious difficulties in levels of food insecurity, in the provisioning, social provisioning at the household level, providing food, fuel, water, etc. And of course, the domestic burdens can also extend to reproductive concerns, based in, the socially constructed gender norms. And again, in our paper, we're really trying to look principally from the perspective of the Global South, which of course faces the greatest threats, and where we see gender and other forms of inequality intersecting. So the paper, as we said, aims to propose the principles for a gender just transition, drawing on some of this empirical literature. So on the one hand, we say gender injustice arises from climate change, but what we also see when we look at the transition policies to address climate issues, and the next slide, please, we also see that the transitions themselves, because they're blind to the underlying structural inequalities, because they ignore gender issues or are biased in some way, also may exacerbate or at least not challenge these underlying inequalities. So we see gender justices, and there's different areas of work. Again, there's a lot of empirical work, and Julia in particular can talk very much more to the energy transitions. It's what she's been working on. But we can see from many studies that the actual policies, the efforts to address climate transitions may exacerbate gender injustice. Of course, we can ask the question of whether just transition or transition policies should be responsible for transforming or changing and challenging underlying structural inequalities that are there. But at least I think we can make a strong argument that they should not exacerbate or should not, should consciously not reproduce them. And that means making visible some of these negative impacts. So we see, for example, the examples here as putting in solar power where you have grid capacity that women in households find too low to cook with. We find distribution of time use and leisure time, who benefits, who loses. Often men are benefiting more. We see the same with income distribution, impacts of these interventions. So we cannot assume that just because we're achieving our transition policies or goals in some criteria, that we are necessarily challenging gender relations or benefiting women. The same is true in terms of land. We can equally see examples there. Women, we know, have less control over income, less control over land, but land is often a core input, particularly the commons and public resources in land, as well as privately owned land. So these existing inequalities are reproduced often during the kinds of transition policies. So just giving one example recently from work we're looking at in China, where as part of climate, their ambitious carbon neutrality goals, they have what are called ecological red lines. And within those areas which are defined by these red lines, you can no longer do any kind of activity, even collecting fuel, foraging, etc., food resources. And this really impacts on the whole poor, marginal, and often women as the main providers in those households. And that we see replicated around the world. So in addition to these injustices, if we can move to the next slide, but moving on from those injustices, we look at the concept of what we mean by just transition, or how just transition is used. And I think, as Imran's pointed to, this was a concept that has taken on any meaning. The meaning has been essentially watered down. It means what people want it to mean often. So it evolved. The original concept came from the 1970s union movement, in a period when the environmental impacts of polluting heavy industries was becoming very apparent. And so the union demands were really about a just transition in terms of labor, jobs, reemployment, retraining for the workers who were going to be affected by either factory closures or the end of the closure of polluting industries. So it was really about organized labor, but it's been developed and applied and taken up in the context of environmental movements, climate movements, decarbonization movement. So for the transition to a low carbon economy. And in this sense, it has expanded beyond organized labor to broader concerns about social injustices and other dimensions of inequality in climate change. And of course, we've seen it adopted. I mean, we see it coming through a lot of new Green Deals, post-COVID recovery plans, but also at the global level, ILO, UN, Paris climate agreements, etc. So it's very widely used, but how can we make it a term that really has meaning and that also supports a gender equitable transition process? So moving on, we look in the paper at the different ways in which both the term has evolved and been used, and also the kind of policy approaches that underpin it. So stepping back a little bit and to thinking about different policy approaches, we draw on previous work, both my own work at UNRISD, where we were looking at how to integrate social, economic, and environmental issues into this notion of sustainable development, drawing on earlier work by Clapp and Deverne. And we can identify a lot of policy approaches from the sort of marketized, if we like, business as usual, status quo, what some might call greening capitalism, corporate action, carbon credit markets, geoengineering technological solutions. So the kind of solutions to problems that do not challenge the underlying structures of, the way the economy is organized and the way goods and services are produced. So that's at one end of the spectrum, if you like. And in this diagram, which doesn't quite capture all of the range of approaches we talk about in the paper, but it's just a way to simplify them, that would be a more incrementalist approach that has quite limited implications for how we think about justice, and would tend to focus on the narrow and immediate impacts of those losers, such as people who immediately lose their jobs. We can then think about more institutional and managerial reform processes. Here, we might be looking towards the right-hand side with top-down transition processes. This could be the trade union approach. And here we can see more concerns with distribution in these approaches, but still they would tend to be quite limited, not very participatory, and relatively top-down. But if we move up the graph to think about a more participatory and inclusive approach, then we may be involving more structural reform, including more procedural justice, participation of different groups who might be affected. Where we're trying to go is to push on both those dimensions, to think about a more systemic change, transformative change that would really also challenge the underlying structural inequalities, make visible the underlying structural inequalities and find ways to change them. And that obviously includes both distributional issues and more participatory procedural issues. So that's a sort of, I mean, again, in the paper, we go into much more detail on the different approaches to justice embedded within these different policy approaches to transition or climate transitions. Next slide, please. So then thinking and layering on these policy approaches, what are the different views of justice and what constitutes justice? Of course, we can get into huge philosophical debates on all of this, but just very briefly, the elements of justice that are most commonly seen in distribution in the environmental climate literature and many other literatures. First, distributional. I think that speaks for itself about fair, equitable distribution. But of course, who is the recipient of that more equitable distribution is what we've just said can be interpreted very differently in these different approaches. Procedural, who gets included in this process, how much participation is there, how open and transparent is the process. Recognition, I think this is a really important one, which often gets ignored, but you cannot really achieve a fair distribution or a fair process if you don't know who is not being included or who is being excluded or who is not benefiting, etc. So recognition, in some sense, precedes these other forms of justice. We need to understand and recognize these inequalities. And obviously, from a gender perspective, the argument is that many of these processes are blind to the kind of exclusions based on gender. And then finally, of course, there's the issue which has come up increasingly at a global level in terms of loss and damage, but also at a local level. So restorative justice, how to redress and remediate past injustices and harm from the local to the global level. So those are the sort of levels of justice, the key elements of justice we talk about. And what we're doing now, and I'll hand over to Julia in a minute, but let me just introduce a little bit if we move to the next slide. What we're trying to do is then layer on. We've said, you know, we can see there are climate injustices, there's injustice, gender injustice from climate change and from transition. We've looked at different approaches, policy approaches to climate transitions. We've tried to unpack the different elements of justice within each of those approaches, and there's a much more detailed table in the paper on that. And then we have to ask our question, well, where does gender justice come? What are the kind of elements, key elements that we would want to highlight that any policy should be looking at, any transition plan should be looking at if it's really going to try and grapple with this question of structural exclusions and gender injustices. And before I hand over to Julia, the approach where we started thinking about this in feminist approaches, you know, and how I would talk about is the sort of, we looked at them across a range of different disciplines, so feminist economists, political economists, ecologists, etc. But broadly, there are a lot of differences within these disciplines, but broadly across them, there's a concern with interrogating the ways in which knowledge is produced and the values, assumptions, and biases that inform this production. And so in the context of climate and environmental change, the feminist epistemologies challenge dominant framings of climate change and its solutions. For example, whether it's scientific, a technological problem, where it's market driven. Clearly with differences among feminists, but I think with a common epistemological and a common objective. So it calls for attention to these gendered social, cultural, political institutions that underlie gender inequalities. And it also, of course, if we think about gender across any issue and walk of life and location, it has to be intersectional. Any just transition needs to take seriously inequalities at the intersection of gender, and any gendered approach or feminist approach looks at those intersections. Women gender inequalities are, of course, differ by race, gender, class, other ethnicity, other identities. And so our goal now is to provide a framework for thinking about these inequalities, drawing on some key concepts that feminists and across different disciplines use. And so I'll turn over here to Julia to continue the presentation.
Great, thanks, Sarah. Yeah, so I think one of the main criticisms of feminist approaches around just transition is that there's a narrow focus in kind of the more reformist views of just transition that just looks at, you know, what are the job changes going to be? Is there going to be an increase or a decrease in formal jobs? And how can we maintain the status quo in this transition more broadly? And so this avoids the kind of acknowledgement that the informal sector is also affected by transition. Unpaid care work is also affected by climate change and transition. And so many feminists argue for a kind of more expanded view, and that's what we're going to try and kind of outline in the next few slides. There's also, you know, the fact that similar economic structures and power dynamics that have contributed to the ecological crisis also produce intersecting gender, race, and class inequalities. And there's a tendency to view women as either victims of climate change and transition or saviors. And these ideas can oversimplify gender dynamics and assume that women are a homogeneous group, which is obviously not true. And so we really need to take into account nuance and understand different contexts and you know, vulnerabilities to really identify who's vulnerable and kind of what are the levers for change that aren't just simplifying these complex issues. So feminist theory offers several key concepts to expand the conception of a just transition and tries to avoid these kind of reductionist and simplified approaches. So some of the key concepts that we drew on in the literature and in the paper are care and social reproduction, which I'll talk a bit more about in the next few slides. Secondly, access to resources. So as we saw in the case studies from the Global South of impacts of climate change and transition, access to resources such as land, energy has a huge impact on gender and the distribution of care work in the household. Thirdly, intersectionality is so important. As Sarah mentioned, you know, it's not only women that are often suffering from kind of various issues around climate change and transition, but all forms of social difference that increase inequality and exacerbate these structural inequalities. Fourth is knowledge creation. So yeah, Sarah also touched on this, where we have to really understand who are the holders of knowledge and how is that influencing policy in the climate space, and can, you know, how does that inform power and in climate policy as well. And lastly, some of the ideas that have come out of feminist thinking around alternative approaches. So instead of thinking about growth alone, what about thinking about provisioning and sufficiency in terms of our understanding of what the economy is for and how climate change should, how we should adapt to climate change, instead of kind of thinking about it as an economic problem, rather think about it as something that you know, needs to be addressed for the well-being of all people. And this links to the ideas of depletion and regeneration. So, you know, the destruction of the environment and broader climate change issues causes depletion of our natural resources, as well as kind of the care work that goes into looking after ourselves and each other, as well as our environment. And so there's a current kind of trend of ongoing depletion in our current system. And so how can we think about an alternative approach, which is about regeneration and supporting provisioning and life? Just to touch on this kind of framework around unpaid care work and care work, in case for those in the audience who are climate people and aren't used to these feminist terms, this is just a graph that outlines a nice description of how time use in the household is divided. And obviously this is a generalization and would vary between different contexts. But interestingly, it does seem that across the world, women conduct the most unpaid work in the household. And so that means cooking, cleaning, childcare, growing food, and various other activities that really promote life and are affected by climate change. And we can see there's also a difference between, developing countries, women in developing countries, and against those in developed countries. That there does seem to be an overall, more work being done in developing countries in terms of both paid and unpaid work. Something that is often missed in our understanding of GDP, and which is why feminist theory kind of highlights well-being and care, is that this kind of the visible economy really captures a very small portion of what's happening in reality. So the size of the formal and informal economy is captured in GDP, but what GDP entirely misses is the contribution of unpaid care, which is so vital for survival, as well as the contribution of environmental and ecological systems. Lastly, this is just a slide that shows, how care work, if it was valued in terms of monetary value and paid accordingly, it can almost compare to, the global gross value added in terms of paid work. So on the left-hand side, this diagram shows different kinds of unpaid work, from cooking, volunteering, childcare, housework, laundry, and then comparing that to the paid kind of global gross value added. You can see that it's almost the same size. And yet we see these kind of unpaid care, kind of unpaid care work as completely invisible and unproductive in our economy, which feminists challenge. So how can we reimagine justice for a gender-just transition, accounting for these different theories that feminists have put forward, and bringing in some of the lessons from the case studies in the Global South that we've described in the beginning? So we have then applied some of these feminist learnings to the 4 pillars of justice. And to start with distributive justice, we argue that there needs to be equal access to employment for women with decent work, and rights and entitlements for informal workers as well. There should be access to and control over resources such as land and water, which form the basis of livelihoods in many parts of the Global South. Transition policies should not only be defined by institutionalized privileges such as land ownership, but rather be based on an understanding of uses, needs, responsibilities of all those who rely on those resources. The public and affordable provision of social goods is vital in terms of distributive justice. This includes education, healthcare, child and elderly care, energy and water infrastructure, and social protection, which can help to relieve and redistribute some of the care and social reproductive work. So at the moment, in terms of the unpaid care work happening in the home, if there's broader public provision, that can reduce the strain on households. There's also a need for a transformative approach to what we see as valuable in our economy and what types of labor are valued, and what this means for how economic resources are channeled. In terms of participatory justice, we need to rebalance the focus of participation in, just transition policies from elites to marginalized groups. So not only do we need to make sure that marginalized groups are included, but actually prioritize some of those views because of the dominance and power relations that have kind of preceded in policy negotiations so far. So procedures should be designed equitably, have an understanding of the intersectional gendered local context regarding governance and decision-making processes, how different inputs may be given, in what settings different groups may have voice, specifically thinking about language barriers. We need to understand established livelihoods and ownership structures. there need to be inputs from marginalized groups that are valued as experts for their own contexts, democratically considered and actually reflected in outcomes. And so participation can be the basis for redistribution embedded in new governance, management, and ownership regimes. In terms of recognitional justice, we have to recognize social inequalities and understanding how inequalities arise and are perpetuated, acknowledging what different groups have already done for sustainability, climate change, and the just transition is important, along with understanding the care work that's conducted for people and environment, which is often done by Indigenous people or traditional groups. Recognizing and incorporating knowledge and values of marginalized groups, and thereby changing the metrics, indicators, and goals of the process itself. There needs to be a shift away from the framings of climate change as a purely scientific and technological problem, which tends to present knowledge as objective, value-free, and independent of social location. We know that the technological fixes at the moment for climate change have not worked, and so we need to understand what a broader systemic shift can look like. And so new approaches and kind of guiding frameworks that could offer a more transformative view of what the economy could look like include things like understanding and putting at the center an ethic of care, a resistance to the commodification of nature, public goods and services, and the use of well-being approaches instead of GDP and growth. Lastly, restorative justice seeks to acknowledge, compensate, and repair harms which have also been gendered. For example, in extractive industries such as coal, men and women are differently affected, and that should be acknowledged and compensated. Restoration is not only for people, but also for the environment. So, you know, there's a need for rehabilitation of mine land, detoxification of soils, and restoration of biodiversity. This is linked to the restoration of land and the protection of the commons. And there's also a need to repair the harm caused by broader political systems that have resulted in structural inequalities, colonialism, land dispossession, and the fossil fuel dependent development of the global north, which has really fueled climate change. So this really requires climate reparations, locally and internationally. In conclusion, the transition is already underway in many countries, including the global south, but gender justice is often neglected, and there's a risk that the transition won't be just at all. So here in this paper and in this presentation, we've looked at some empirical evidence of injustices in the global south, and then use feminist theoretical literature to extract some lessons that could be applied to the pillars of justice. And through this, we want to promote an expansive and transformative view of justice within the just transition. And lastly, I just wanted to acknowledge the two authors who aren't here with us speaking today, but that's Katrina Lehman-Gruber and Shomali Cerise, who were really important to this project and unfortunately couldn't be here. Thanks so much. I'll hand back over to you, Imran.
Great. Thank you so much, Julia and Sarah. So let's move then straight on to the colleagues who've kindly agreed to be discussants and share some of their views, both on the paper, but also much more broadly around these issues. I think Sergi, who's connecting from the US, has a bit of a time issue, so I'm going to go to her first. Kind of over to you, Sergi.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Imran. Thank you, Julia, Sarah, and the team at WITS for inviting me. I find this paper really interesting. And let me first start with congratulating your team for putting together what I think is both a primer as well as an analytical think piece from a feminist perspective. And the question that this paper attempts to answer is really an important and urgent one: what a gender-just transition could and should look like, particularly in the global south. And the response you provided in the paper serves as an important and urgent, serves as an urgent message emphasizing the climate injustices and the possible impacts of transition policies, replicating and even exacerbating pre-existing gender inequalities and other forms of injustices. So, and the paper, in my view, tries to, have this balance between, showing the general trends about, for example, women, how they are impacted in general around, across the world, and in particular in the South, by the, not only by climate change and the causes of climate change, but also the manner in which this transition is already unfolding. That said, I think the paper has some very important points, but in some cases tends to be buried, and also they can be connected and made more made more clear in terms of connecting the first part of the paper with the second part. I think your presentation, both Julia and Sarah, today, with the introduction of Imran, provides that clarity. But in the paper, there seems to be some sort of, sections that are very general, and then the sections that are more nuanced. So first, let me say that that the key point tend to be somewhat buried in the second part of your paper. You discuss the distributive justice, and which I really enjoy, the different approaches to just transition and using a feminist lens. That key point in particularly page 18, which Julia mentioned in the presentation, there's been some tendency in the strands of work on gender and the environment to position women as either victims or saviors in the climate crisis. Well, somewhat the discussion of the impact of climate change tend to have that generalization. I think it would be good to make, the paper brings out these nuances and richness and challenges, but I think it would be good to have that come out more clearly and in a coherent way throughout the paper. So having said that, I'd like to highlight just 3 points. First, I think that the message you have of what the feminist lens, feminist economics bring into the discourse, into the analysis, and into the debate of how the just transition and even the continued discussion of the impact of climate change is a very good and rich one. I really like the tables that you provided in the second part of the paper. But it would be good to summarize that very clearly right at the very beginning. And I think it's, for example, what the feminist perspective is that it makes clear that women's experiences and perspectives in different settings and contexts are distinct and likely to be distinct from those of men, and they must be seriously considered in any discussion and negotiation. That point comes out very clearly in the second part of your paper, the importance of gender roles and gender power relations that shape women's interests and experience, and their capacity and ability to mitigate the impact and to also develop their resilience. And I think linking it to also some of the climate communities' language, adaptation, mitigation, resilience, and giving clear examples of what insight and illumination of enriching and making more effective the transition policies would be a very good contribution of the paper. The second point I'd like to bring out is that I think even though there was an acknowledgement of the intersectionality of gender with other structures of inequalities, I think it's also important to highlight the point that there are existing power relations that currently are dictating the discourse on the climate agenda. And I think it would be good to make this visible and challenge these existing power relations that determine whether or not to undertake transition in the first place. I mean, the United States, we have here continued expansion, and in other countries, continued expansion of fossil fuel extraction and gas extraction, even though we're wanting to move towards the elimination of the use of fossil fuel. It also, that power relations also dictate what climate solutions are considered, what's on the table and what's not on the table, and which of the options being discussed are going to be supported and implemented. I think we need to be aware that the challenges we have for meeting and implementing the gender just transition is a huge one, but we should not feel overwhelmed by that huge challenge. And some examples of this challenge and why it's important to look at the power relationships that are unfolding, that's dictating the transition policies, is also important, and linking it with and looking at it from a feminist lens would be an important contribution of this paper. Let me cite, if I may, one example. In Africa, we all agree that's gonna need to move to clean energy. Both it will affect women, as we know that, in terms of the use of dirty energy in cooking and cleaning. And there's all this discussion of transitioning. And what's being touted in Africa today and in the COP 27 UN Climate Summit that was held in Egypt is LPG gas. The future of Africa's vast gas reserve has been a major topic in that climate change. Okay. So many countries are moving forward. A lot of the leaders there are also pushing this, that they say, okay, gas, we know that, in the 2050, we should not be using fossil fuel and we should not be using gas. But this is just a stopgap solution. And as you will note, as in fact, The Guardian noted that there were more than 600 fossil fuel, gas and oil executives and lobbyists at that talk. The point I'm trying to make it is that that solution is being criticized even by the African climate experts and activists who are against the expansion of the gas in the continent. And so that aspect needs, to be reckoned with, that there is this debate, this conflict, of even what type of solution to address clean energy. And in that discussion, the question is, where's the voice of women? What is it that they want? What are the needs of women? And what would that clean transition be? Would it be electrification and solar panel, or will it be LPG gas? So anyway, the reason I'm bringing this up is to move to my second point. I think how the gender just transition is going to unfold will require really two things. One is a global strategy, but also local strategy. And there is deep uncertainty regarding the future that each local communities, men and women around the world, are facing. Dealing with this deep uncertainty of complex systems such as climate change will require constant monitoring and adjustment of plans. And that point really means, going back to the procedural justice that you're raising, means that at every single level, you will need men and women's experiences and perspective and needs to be reflected, particularly those who suffer. And this point is, I think, an important one, that at the end of the day, the experiences both of women and men are going to be different at different settings it will be different in the north, and it will be different in the south. So, and commenting finally on the last, on the first part of your paper, where you mentioned something about gender justice transition is distinct from the global north and the global south. I would tend to see it in a different way. I would see it in a way that even within the South, within countries, within regions, experiences of women and men are going to be different. And that differences and distinction based on their gender roles, based on where they are positioned economically, financially, socially, in terms of resources, is going to vary. And that variation has to be part of any discussion of a gender just transition. So in my view, there are commonalities, particularly in the distributional impact of transition policies and any proposed carbon reducing strategies. And even though we have these differences in terms of experiences and settings, it is important to build bridges and coalitions that unite civil societies, organizations, women's groups, and stakeholders into a common role. In my view, addressing this global climate, which is a global crisis, will require collective action. How we bridge together our interests and our needs and discuss what is the best way forward, I think has to start not just at the global level or the national level, but also at the local level. It will be very important for women and men, especially those who bear the cost, to have that discussion at every single phase, both at the local and the national. I think these points are all brought out in the paper, but I'm just picking them out because I think making the paper rich and bringing out the nuances and the challenges, but at the same time providing a clear perspective of how we can address and implement a gender just transition is, I think, one that this paper has that great potential of making us a contribution to the literature. Thank you.
Great, Sergi. Thank you so much for those thoughts, and a special thank you to you for kind of joining us at this hour. What's it? Shortly after 5 a.m.
It's actually almost 7, so it's okay. Not a problem at all.
All right, let's then move on. Let's then move on to Lebo. Kind of over to you, Lebo.
Thanks, Prof. Let me express my gratitude to Julia, as well as Sarah and the other authors for this timely paper. I think, drawing us to the urgency around the need of a gendered just transition, I think is timely, and I'd like to appreciate the opportunity to input. I think if I have to also reflect on the paper and how it highlights policymakers, how policymakers need to look into the various policy recommendations to curb the ecological crisis. What you find is that, it's an indictment on the fact that we don't necessarily apply the necessary gender lens when it comes to policy recommendations. I think the trap that policymakers in this space and those who are active in research within this space, the trap is usually that if we solve for the ecological crisis, then somehow we will have, addressed problem. So we apply sort of a blanket approach, and I think neglecting, the application of the gender lens in the question around the gender just transition often makes policymakers to kind of like allow the gender question to fall through the cracks. And I think what this study is already asking us to do is to apply that critical lens. I think, especially when you look at the interventions made by policymakers in this space, is that the assumption is always that, if you solve for the issues related to job losses, skills development, as well as the various social security nets that are needed for vulnerable groupings, you will have solved the problems for many affected vulnerable groupings. I think when we do that, we tend to neglect the fact that, especially when you look at the energy sector, where we anticipate a significant amount of job losses, the predominant participation within that sector is male, especially in the formal energy sector. And the interventions that we recommend in terms of job creation, skills development, and again social security nets, those usually benefit those who are currently formally employed within energy sector jobs, and without going even deeper into opportunities for, as well as social security nets for predominantly women who participate in the informal sector, exacerbates the challenges that this particular paper has highlighted. So I think what this paper does is it encourages, I want to say force, but it encourages policymakers and researchers to zone in on the gender-specific questions that relate to particularly women in this transition. I think the paper does a very good job of characterizing the gender injustices of climate change. I like the intersection between the ecological crisis as well as the crisis of social reproduction, and that ultimately both are as a result of an exploitation of resources. So, in an attempt to address the transition in a manner that upholds the status quo, and the paper talks about this, an attempt to address the transition in a manner that upholds the status quo without delving deep into transformative change doesn't really solve the questions around how to make sure that there is gender justice when it comes to issues of a just transition. So, accurately, the authors of the paper look at the issue of, how women lack access to resources. And we see this particularly when women have to walk longer distances to access water and wood. If there is a climate disaster, when you look at health issues as well, how women are the primary caregivers to persons who are ill in the household or who are aged, as well as how women lack the ownership of land and lack access to livelihoods. And we see this all too very well in the discussions around the transition. So I think we need to be a bit more deliberate in how we factor in the question of the gender justice in our discussions around the just transition, because like I've said earlier, and I think like the various other speakers have touched on this is not going to happen all by itself. There needs to be a deliberate effort to ensure that a gender lens is applied when it comes to the just transition, and so that we achieve gender justice in the transition. I think, you know, when you look at, for example, the PCC's work on lessons learned from the Komati Power Station experience, what we can see already in that scenario is that when, yes, needless to say, the just transition wasn't accurately, or the just transition did not manifest itself in that particular experience, but even worse, there was a lot of gender injustices in the processes as well. When you speak to the community about the issues that, you know, should be addressed before decommissioning of the power station, women in the community raised issues of, you know, access to healthcare facilities in order to alleviate burdens on women to take care of the elderly as well as the ill in their household, the access of access to ECD facilities, you know, to also alleviate time women have to spend taking care of young children. So in the Komati experience, what you'd find is that there'd be opportunities for reskilling, but what you'd find is that not a lot of women can take advantage of those opportunities for upskilling themselves, because there aren't access to ECD facilities, there aren't access to healthcare facilities, there aren't access to recreational facilities. So as a result, the burden is now placed on women to take the time that they could have used to upskill themselves. They would much rather be in the household, taking care of those unpaid care work sort of activities within the house. So I think if we're not deliberate in our efforts to rectify this, because we've got one example within the Komati Power Station, which has taught us that this is what happens when you get it wrong from a just transition lens, but even worse, from a gendered justice lens, this is how you could potentially get it wrong. Lessons need to be learned out of that in order to improve justice outcomes. I think, you know, one of the things that the paper highlights, which I really appreciate, is this idea around how to go about achieving not just transformative change, but really deep transformative change. You know, with this transition, we have an opportunity to address systematic issues within our society. You know, trying to replace work for displaced workers is not the essence of a just transition. I think that's a very narrow definition of what the just transition can be. It's definitely more than that, and it can be deep and it can be transformative. It just requires us to think more deeply in terms of what our transition can be. And I think there is a need for us to look at how, and I think this is maybe in addition to what the paper could suggest as a possible recommendation or work moving forward of how we can establish monitoring and evaluation frameworks that can apply these gender lenses, so that we can look at projects and programs of a just transition and monitor them in terms of their outcomes as far as gender justice. And I think the table that was included in the paper in terms of the expansive view of gender justice, aligning that expansive view to the various pillars of justice is probably an appropriate starting point in terms of setting up that particular monitoring and evaluation framework. Why I think monitoring and evaluation frameworks are important is because A, this gives us an opportunity to reflect back on what has been done and to course correct. I think South Africa is going through a very unique transition, and the opportunities are what they are, but unique nonetheless. But there is an opportunity to, where things have not gone right, to course correct. Similarly to what we did when it came to the Komati experience, where we identified where things are not going right, and there's an opportunity to course correct to get us to where we want to be. I think there is an opportunity here, and I think this is probably where those of us who are involved in this space have an opportunity to ensure that indeed we do achieve gender justice in our transition to a low carbon economy. And I think this paper is definitely a really good starting point, because again, it forces us to get to the realization that applying the gender justice elements, is urgent because a lot is currently happening in terms of our transition to a low carbon economy. So if we don't apply the necessary course correction, what we'll have is a new industrial complex or a new industry and a new transition that continues to exacerbate sort of the inequalities and the structural problems of the old, which will generally have bad outcomes in terms of women and women's participation. So I see the camera has gone on, so I'm going to leave it there. Thanks.
Thank you so much. I just wanted to keep enough time for us to have questions from the audience. I just want to I'm going to open up for any thoughts or any questions anyone wants to share. I think the way we'll kind of do it is if you can just if you can raise your hand, we should be able to unmute you and would then request that you ask your question sort of in person, as it were, rather than on the chat, and then we can then do a round of responses. So the floor is open for any questions anyone would like to raise. You just need to put up your hand so I can see who would like to ask and to who would like to ask a question. Pauline, in the kind of SEIS team, am I correct that we can take questions by kind of unmuting people?
Yes, I think we can. Imran, there was a question in the chat which we could maybe pose, which I can read out.
Okay, cool. Please do that, Julia.
Great. It was from Kiran Parthab, who says, are there views from philanthropic and global institutions such as the World Bank, United Nations on this topic? Where are some of the leading governments' view on this topic?
Right. So let's see if we have any responses to that. Julia, do you want to respond, or we can go to Sarah too? Let's start with you, Julia.
Sure, thanks. I can try to give a response. So there are, I think Sarah did kind of post a response. I'm not sure if you were able to see it, but there are various organizations that are starting to look at gender and climate change issues. We found kind of at the time of writing, which was which was pretty much last year, it took a while to get the paper out, but that there hadn't been a lot of work done on the intersection of gender and just transition specifically. But I think there's more and more coming out on this topic. I think one of the issues with current views, like, coming from the World Bank and other international organizations, is that, there's a need to focus on women specifically. And so I think Maria's points about intersectionality and looking at both men and women are really important. And I think we are kind of going to think about how we can incorporate and emphasize that more in the paper. But I think that, you know, there's a tendency to say, well, we just need more women in decision-making positions, or we just need more women-owned businesses in the transition. And I think we do. Certainly that's a good step in the right direction. But I think to kind of simplify it to just having women representation in different spaces would be a more kind of reformist approach. And I think if we do want to have a more transformed idea of a transition, we need to not only think about having women in certain spaces, but actually thinking about how we open up spaces and have more inclusive processes so that not only women, but all vulnerable and marginalized groups are incorporated in terms of kind of procedural and recognitive justice approaches. Thanks.
Sarah, anything you want to add?
Yeah, thanks for all the comments and this question. On this question specifically, just I mean, I'd say, you know, the more sort of transformative approaches would be found both, you know, in the light of COVID, the UN Women produced what was called a feminist plan, and it does definitely sort of try to link some of these debates and discussions. It's a feminist plan for sustainable recovery. I can't remember exactly what it's called. And UNRISD, of course, is doing quite a lot of work on this, and they've got a series of policy briefs and things. So I think there's work that you can find. But I think what I would say is that all of these organizations, so we can see the ILO in its just transition and gender justice in its transition thinks about labor because it's the ILO. UNET thinks about it from an environment. So they all bring their different perspectives. And I think what we need really, and then I think people have put in some other organizations like the National Business Initiative, which I don't know, but that would be interesting to look at, World Economic Forum. They come to it from different perspectives. And so what I think we're trying to do here is to say, can we develop the framework that Le Bourgain, I think, was very helpfully sort of showing how would this be useful in a concrete policy framework? That's where we need to go to sort of be able to analyze those different plans. Lots of governments have green transition, et cetera, plans which would also use some of this language. But can we really analyze it in a way that then unpacks what are they really saying? What's driving? What frameworks are they using? And does this really help us move towards what we think of in a more transformative way as gender justice in a transition? So I think that's the next phase we want to go, is really analyzing some of these different viewpoints within national strategies, within global institutions, within sectoral plans, etc., to really then tighten a framework and principles that can be applied and help, you know, these ecofeminist networks that are being referred to, etc., to move the debate forward. Thanks.
Hey, just a kind of additional thought from my side on this question. I'm kind of reminded by kind of something that the Turkish feminist economist Nilüfer Şatay kind of used to say quite often, which is that there's some sort of branches of work that kind of include gender in kind of in an approach where the kind of existing model of how we think about the economy is kept pretty intact. So what kind of she used to say was that approach is one that says put gender into the model and kind of stir it exactly the way you've always done, or you can take the approach of taking a more transformational kind of approach to how you think about the economy and the role kind of gendered relations in in the economy. I think our sense, we sort of started this work about 2 years ago, is that there's work in both of those of those approaches. I think what we're trying to do in this paper is really strengthen the kind of approaches to that more transformational role for how we should think about gender kind of in the economic transition that is related to kind of related to climate change. Let me see if there's any other questions then. Still don't have any hands up. So if anyone would like to ask a question, we still have some time. In the meantime, Julia and Sarah, perhaps you want to respond to some of the points that Sergi and Lebogang had raised. Anything from your side, Julia?
Sure. Yeah, I think it was really useful to get the feedback on you know, some of the flow in the paper and that kind of thing. And we are hoping to kind of, as a next step, try and get this into a journal publication. So I think those kinds of inputs from Maria, thank you so much. That's really useful for that process. And then we also, and in the same time, we want to make sure that our next steps in terms of this research are useful for policymakers. So I think, Lebogang, your insights around the you know, the monitoring and evaluation frameworks and what kind of indicators and kind of key measures we can suggest that could support a more transformative gender just transition, I think is a really interesting challenge for us to take on. I think the points about I think we do, it's so interesting because I think we often we acknowledge that in this paper and focusing on gender and just transition, we've tried to have, you know, be intersectional as much as possible, but even we can fall into the trap of saying women are most likely to because that is, you know, a framework within which we work, and that's a lot of the data is gathered in terms of that, you know, categorization. But I think we really do want to try and take an approach where we understand that different contexts and different cultures have different approaches to unpaid care work even. So looking at particularly the distribution of unpaid work, whether it's done by women or other family members, which is often the case, you know, actually what are the systems that can support care more broadly? And so there's a project that we've also been working on with other colleagues at the Southern Centre for Inequality Studies, and we have a bit of a working group around what a care climate nexus could look like. And Maria is also kind of involved in that process. So that's another piece of work that we're working on that I think tries to look at care specifically and think about how care and climate change are connected, and how the kind of crisis of both climate and care can exacerbate one another. And so then how can we think about policies that will really address both care and climate as well? Because, these kind of burdens end up exacerbating inequalities more broadly. Thanks. Those are just some initial thoughts.
Great, Julia. Thank you. Sarah, anything from your side?
Well, thank you both, Sergi and Lebogang, for fabulous comments. And as the others have said, it's been a long process, this paper. And I started working on this, as I said, the workshop was even a couple of years before we started on this specific paper. And so I think having your fresh perspectives on sort of, particularly, Sergi, your points about the sort of threads running through and how to elevate some core messages that are there but a bit buried, I think is really useful for us in thinking about as Julia says, publications and next phases, but also then about where to go. And I think this paper, and this comes to the concrete examples from how it's useful to somebody in a policy context in South Africa, or to an NGO or feminist movement, or whoever. I think that's what we need to sort of test now, is can this, and I really appreciate that both of you have highlighted the paper, the table in the paper where we try to bring these together. Because I think that is sort of a lot of thought getting to that. But that's the basis on which I think we can now say, is this a framework, or does it provide the basis for developing to a framework where we can then analyze, for example, what's happening in coal sector, what's happening in an electric vehicle sector, what's happening in a supply chain from lithium through to whatever. So what's happening, how do we analyze green transition plans of different national governments, municipalities, etc., where they're happening? So I think to make this useful beyond sort of a nice set of ideas to practitioners, to policymakers, to thinkers at different levels from global to local level. And particularly, I think also, as Sergi pointed to those trying to create cross-class, cross-region, cross-country, transnational, etc., alliances around these issues. All of these we need to take forward, but we also really need to work with some of you who've written comments about your work in the comments to think how we take this forward concretely. And I think I'll stop there for now. Maybe we can, it'd be great to hear from other questions if there are. I think there's one person now with their hand up. Great.
Right, let's go to Ruth, and then we have a question in the chat as well, which I'll read out. So Ruth, over to you.
So thanks everyone for a really interesting presentation. And I've just been going through the table, and I think it really does provide such a useful framework for thinking about these questions. But I did wonder in the process how it is that you're wrestling with questions of power and contestation and the role of capital and the kinds of policies that capital can drive that might, prevent this kind of vision from moving forward. So
right, and then there's a question from Boris, who writes, thank you very much. If the Komati case serves as a cautionary tale, did you come across examples of successful just transition yet? So Sarah, you want to have a go perhaps at Ruth's kind of Ruth's one?
Yeah.
Komati issues are more specifically South African one, so perhaps to deal with that one.
Great, thanks. No, I think where I was about to get to, and I sort of paused to hear the questions, was actually how we discussed, as we were writing this paper, how to engage with debates around what we can term degrowth. There are lots of other terminologies used. And I think this gets to the heart of these issues of the role of capital in highly financialized economies, what's the imperative for growth in low-income economies in order to manage transitions? Where does that growth come from, and how is it going to be achieved? And I think there's a really difficult set of issues that we sort of move back from. It's there implicitly in the different approaches to transition policies, from the climate business as usual, greening capitalism, which obviously doesn't challenge, to those which want a more transformative model. But I think the issue then of what a transformation to low decarbonized economies can mean in the context of who benefits from growth, what does growth look like if it's going to grow, or how do we need different measures for thinking about progress, well-being, development? And so I think that thorny problem, and I'm not really answering your question directly, Ruth, because we didn't discuss it fundamentally enough, but I think obviously it is the core of these. Can a financialized model lead to the transformative changes we need, and what would alternatives look like? How does the sort of decarbonization in terms of degrowth ideas of development, what does that really mean for expanding economies, which has to happen in a different way? So I think those are some of the challenges that we touched on in the process of writing the paper, but which really remain major political challenges that are out there for the next phase, I think, of consideration. In terms of just touching on, I'll hand over to Julia, but I think the issue, the broader question that was raised about, what are success stories? I think these are processes. Nowhere has transitioned, but are there examples that we can draw on of processes that seem to be trying to integrate gender? And I think that's where I was saying before, we need now to take these principles and look and analyze different sectors and different examples in order to be able to say, well, maybe this is a pathway that looks like it's moving in the right direction, or these in this context doesn't work. But I think they are going to be very context, sectoral, etc., specific. And hopefully from those we can draw broader principles and lessons. Julia.
Right, Julia.
Thanks. Yeah, I guess in terms of Ruth's question, I think the kind of status quo and reformist approaches are obviously being promoted amongst owners of capital and kind of private interests, largely, I think, because we have a severely unequal system, but it works for a couple of people, and often those people are involved in the elite processes of policy making, and so I think trying to question the makeup of who can be in a room around, and who is having the final say on what a just transition policy looks like is a really important point. That, for example, in South Africa, we have a just energy transition investment plan, which was not developed in the most transparent way. And so there has been a lot of civil society engagement and criticism of that process, and that has led to some shifts in the plan and bringing in new ideas and new concepts. And so I agree with Sarah in that there isn't like one example of a perfectly just transition that has happened in a specific region, but there are examples of processes and stories where I think more just transitions are hopefully emerging. And so I think, civil society in South Africa are certainly playing a really important role to hold policymakers accountable to justice and distribution and all the different forms of justice. And I think there's also some exciting examples from different countries. So there are examples from Germany where, coal power plants have been shut down, but every single worker was given a huge package and kind of ongoing support in terms of social protection. So how do those kind of examples of social protection work in other contexts? There's also exciting ideas coming up around, how can energy transitions be more just? I've been doing some research in the Northern Cape in South Africa, where there's been an increase in development of solar power plants. But a lot of the time, the solar power plants are not necessarily kind of providing electricity to the communities in the vicinity. And so, some of the ideas and suggestions put forward by those communities are to say, well, can we not have small scale power generation of our own? And so I think there are ideas and demands being made in various ways that I think can be taken on board and kind of discussed in these policy arenas, that in ways that kind of prioritize the needs of the most vulnerable, where kind of unemployment is a huge issue, where informality means that there's kind of more precarious employment and livelihoods. And then I think in general, often we separate climate policy from other policies and see it as something that's happening on the side, and is getting a lot of and is kind of being prioritized in many ways by policy, and so we need to actually question, well, should it be set aside in such a way? Do we not need to also include and think about all policies and our social provisioning in the economy and climate policy kind of all together? So we can't, for example, reduce spending in education in order to support climate adaptation. We have to think about these things holistically. And so I think, ongoing demands for social justice can contribute to issues of climate justice and just transition as well. Thanks.
Right. Right. So I don't see any further questions. So perhaps we should bring the webinar to a close. Let me kind of again just make a special mention of our our two co-authors who are kind of unable to kind of join us today. So special thank you to Cerise and and to Katrina for the work on the paper. Thank you to our presenters. A special thank you to kind of Sergi and to Lebo for their kind of really thoughtful and useful comments and suggestions. Thank you to the team of people who are in the background, who kind of organized this kind of event and made sure that it ran without any glitches. You all know who you are, so thank you all for that. Thank you to all of you who joined us kind of in the webinar today. For those who are interested in the paper, the paper is available on our website. You will also find there kind of information about other work that the Centre is doing in this regard. So thank you all for joining us. Have a good afternoon if you're in South Africa, and a good morning or a good evening, depending on which part of the world outside of kind of our time zone that you're in. And kind of do look forward to seeing you at one or other of the Centre's events that would be coming up from time to time. Please, if you don't subscribe to our mailing list, please feel free to go to the website, and you'll find details of who you can email to make sure that you join all of our events. All right. With that, let me close. Thank you, everyone, and goodbye.